investigated destruction techniques, programming of the game, interior build of game controller, and the game construct. But it was also all about working back and forth with Snake Eyes to understand psychology of the game, the fierce competition among players, and so on. When you think about it, the controller as a form of body-machine interface enables human action and interaction in a space, be it physical or virtual. And to me, this is no less architecture than our furniture, physical spaces, or buildings. The final product of the class was a fully working prototype on which Snake Eyes could train and test, as well as filing a joint design patent. This basic understanding of human body led me to my current research, which is how humans and things move and interact in space. This is a project done by Anonymous, where we turn into agent-based tools and simulations. What was really at stake for us was to focus on human movement in space and how that could determine the design of medical office. Unlike most who use simulation software to test or vasting spatial configurations, we used simulation engine itself as a design tool. The project began with a simple layout of programmatic spaces that, through a series of simulation, gradually evolve into the final plan. The goal was to achieve a design that offers the most efficient, fluid, and frictionless pattern of circulation, which was mandated by the client. In the past, this type of investigations were only possible through experimentation and construction of mock-ups and tests in physical spaces that were most of the time not possible. Simulation allows for an experimental approach to our design, which I believe is the only way to respond to complex behavior of humans, occupants, fluids, gases, or machines in spaces. The studies of heat map from the previous slide allowed us to understand potential conflicts and bottlenecks. The final strategy was for people, doctors, nurses, staff, and patients to move around two separate racetracks. The racetrack go around nurses' stations, where inside you can find doctors' offices. And as you can see in this video, the exams rooms are located on the perimeter of the plan. Waiting room, reception desk, admin, and other offices are located in the central space. And as all these different colored dots move around, you can see their interaction within the space. And finally, this is just under construction, so just a few photos of the building itself. And back to academic research. I had a chance to work with Greg Lin and Kai-Ho Yu in a mobility program at UCLA, where we began the research with understanding basics, in our case, machines, such as autonomous robots. The key was for us to understand their physical capabilities as well as behaviors. And with that in mind, we simulate robots' movement in space. The path that they occupy in space, their interactions with obstacles, and of course with humans. Here, a Jita robot attempts to follow human beings and be a companion, or a Dyson robot that fills space with modules. Its goal is to cover largest possible surface and make sure it doesn't miss a spot, which is a rather difficult task to achieve. But in my seminar, we really tested these ideas in natural scale and built full-scale environmental mock-ups to explore the consequences of our thinking. Here, a new type of Frankfurt kitchen is one that relegates domestic functions to the kitchen to a working triangle. The dynamic triangle connects static functions, fridge, moving functions, robotic trash can, and a human being. The dynamic functions of the kitchen aim at collaboration, in a preparation of a meal, and few images of the motion and movement from the machine point of view. Another example of autonomous furniture is a plant that can travel within a space and avoid obstacles to complete its mission. This moving plant navigates within a fragment of non-stop city with the use of simultaneous localizations and mapping. The rule of movement was that after humans leave the premises of the site, the plant goes toward windows to find daylight and therefore to self-care for itself. And the last chapter will focus on industry research and most kind of recent approach. I'm currently an innovation lead at Google R&D for built environment at Excel. I am not at the liberty to show much of the work that I do at R&D, maybe just this few images that you can see here, but I'll present the next project, which is called the balloon wall. And the balloon wall addresses rigidity of an open office by providing spaces for ad hoc collaboration and spontaneous encounters. The open office layout has contributed to workspace distraction and loss of privacy for both individuals and teams. Meanwhile, majority of unplanned meetings in an open office occurs at the office floor rather than in the meeting rooms. And the open office is not usually equipped to support such a spontaneous event. So the balloon wall is an example of autonomous furniture that could be deployed on request in the open office. It could create microspaces within macro space of the office floor. And again, RAF testing and prototyping was part of the process to evaluate mobility, maneuverability, rotation in place, expansion, and ability to integrate a whiteboard. So when we look at the final prototype, the final prototype moves autonomously through space, relying solely on machine vision through the use of simultaneous localization and mapping and a turtle bot. SLAM allows for the robot to construct a map of the environment while moving and simultaneously locate itself within the map, navigate and avoid obstacles. It also updates information as it continues to discover new obstacles within the floor plan, such as someone putting a backpack on the ground that wasn't there before, and so on. Once it arrives at the location, it can use its mobility to expand and therefore inflate in order to divide or enclose a space. The membrane is made out of iridescent material that is fully biodegradable as a commitment to the use of healthy materials. The membrane allows the light to come through, yet it provides visual privacy as information and detail won't be coming through. And this mobile furniture solutions shows us potential of creating a more dynamic and reactive, hopefully, in the future. And that will be it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Marta. May I invite Dori to share?
Yes, I will share my screen now.
Thank you.
So let me begin by acknowledging the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat, who are its original owners and custodians of the lands in which I'm gathered here today in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, or known by its Mohawk name, Takaranto. So we're going to talk to you sort of a little bit meta about decolonizing design and tech and the necessity in some ways for us to change the consciousness of the human-technology relations behind us. Just again, a little bit of background as my beautiful introduction. I'm going to say I'm the first Black and Black female dean of a faculty design anywhere. By background, I'm a design anthropologist, so I look at the relationship between culture and making, and I'm African American by heritage. Again, at ACADIA University, we have, as dean of the faculty design, I'm under the domain of 6 programs. Environmental design, which looks at sort of architecture, landscape, as well as sort of urban planning, industrial design, material art design, illustration, advertising, and graphic design programs. And we try to, as much as possible, ignore the boundaries that exist between those disciplines in order to create a holistic experience for our students. The ethos of the faculty design is respectful design, and it comes out of our way of thinking about what is our relationship, internal relationship as sort of creators and makers, and the kind of people that we want to be in terms of our relationships to others. So in our case, we're really looking at respect, and by that respect of different cultures, different ways of being, different ways of existing in the universe, and using all of our creative methodologies to support harmonious relationships between all people and the environment. And again, with my background in anthropology, that what we really focus on is what are the values that we are putting forth, how they are made tangible through design and tech, and then what are the experiences that not just people, but all of our relations are having in relationship to the things that we design. And this has become really important because as we're undergoing this process of decolonization, we're really understanding how design and tech has been quite disrespectful, especially to Indigenous, Black, and POC communities, as well as the land in and of itself. And so for context, like the driver from much of this disrespect for at least the last 500 years has been colonization. And what I mean by that term is basically this process of eliminating Indigenous peoples, polities, and their relationships from and with the land. And thus, what decolonization is about is, according to Eve Tuck and W.K. Yang, it's 1, repatriating the land to sovereign native tribes and nations. 2, the abolition of slavery in its contemporary forms. And 3, the dismantling of the imperial metropole, in which the resources are taken from one place and brought to another in order to build the wealth. And so part of the work we've been doing is looking at the ways in which the values of design and tech have been and still are colonial, white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalist. And again, what that means for communities who have been in many ways negatively impacted by those values. And so just to leave this not in the level of abstraction, I'm going to tell a bit of a colonial story of how design and technology has harmed Black and Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to take you a little bit through history, just to give a little bit of distance from it, but we'll talk about what this means in the contemporary as well. So meet Eli Whitney, Yale graduate, in the 1700s moved to Georgia to work on a Caroline Green's plantation. And because he was indebted, he wanted to basically get rich quick. So in his move, he was trying to figure out how to get rich quick. And the way in which he realized that he wanted to do that is by the establishment of the cotton gin, which was patented in 1794 and was one of the first patents by then the United States of America. So in this process, he did months of research, so mechanical research, fiber research, labor relations, with the help of Mrs. Green, so again, help of a woman, as well as enslaved Africans who were required to test out, again, especially the labor part of his patent. His innovation was actually the use of wire comb technology in order to sort of separate what was in the inner South, that they had short hair cotton as opposed to long hair cotton. And so it would take almost an entire day for enslaved Africans to be able to remove the seed from the fiber. And as part of his process, he wanted to derive his income from licensing, but then got caught up in patent wars. So I think it's really important when we talk about design and tech that we understand what intended consequences are, because we talk a lot about unintended consequences, but the intended consequences of this invention was the governing values were efficiency and to make fast money. The outcomes that were sought to be produced was reducing the time for enslaved people to clean cotton from 1 day to 1 hour. And that this would allow farmers to increase, and did allow farmers to increase cotton cultivation, because now the labor was cheap enough, enslaved labor was cheap enough to allow them to actually make a profit. Intended consequences of this invention was that the number of enslaved Africans went from 700,000 in 1790 to 3.2 million in 1850. Another intended consequences is that then the desire for land in order to further cultivate cotton accelerated the efforts to remove indigenous nations from west to the west of the Mississippi River. So where in 1785, let's say the Cherokee Nation's lands were protected by treaty, just 6 years later, they were forced to give up those lands. And then by 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which again led to the forced removal of indigenous nations, sovereign nations, to west of the Mississippi. Although some did remain and fought back, and some have remained, again, even though they were dispossessed for their land as a general community. And unintended consequences was that there are stories that the cotton gin technology is actually what set the conditions for the Civil War. And then returning to Eli Whitney, he actually never made his money on the cotton gin because of the patent wars that he got involved with. But he actually made his money from the innovation of the mass production processes for guns that were used during the Civil War. So the moral of the story is that technology from misguided values, in this case, efficiency and fast money, causes irreparable harm to others. Now, looking at this, then taking this a bit out of the past, is that we have constantly heard stories about negative impact of technologies because they've been based on misguided values. So efficiency is one value that we still consider as part of technology. And making fast money in many cases is another value that we still attach to technology. For us in sort of design, one of the things that becomes important for us to unpack is that in many ways, when we talk about the Modernist Design project as something that came out of Europe, that's something that made the promise of progress, which said that through technology, we can bring luxury to the masses. That through this sense of universal humankind or mankind, that if you drop your national and ethnic baggage, then again, all of us can live better lives. But in many ways, this notion of progress, which really, again, deeply, deeply is embedded in the narratives that we use around technology, has not been the case. And in fact, as the Eli Whitney example shows, that sense of progress has been based on the great harm to enslaved African and indigenous North American sovereign nations. So the question we have to ask ourselves is that progress for whom? One of the things that I try to explore with my students is the underlying consciousness of the technologies that we build. And many of our quote unquote modern technologies are based on a master-slave relationship. So when we talk about human computer interactions, that many of them are based on human interactions from the past. So I say to my students that, 150 years ago, Siri might have been an enslaved indigenous or Black woman. Because many of the ways in which we create our technologies is to replace activities that were formerly done by human beings. And thus, our nightmares in technology is actually based on white fears of the slave rebellion. And so this is a movie still from the image I, Robot, which is based on Isaac Asimov's story and is, again, a failed coup d'etat by the machines, right? And whether we're talking about The Matrix or Terminator or any of these, our science fiction films today, that the underlying fear that we have of the fear of the machine, the fear of technology, is that they will, in many ways, enslave human beings. And again, that is because the underlying consciousness of some of the high technologies that we've developed, again, were based on relationships that existed 150 years ago, 200 years ago, of actual enslavement of human beings. And again, these fears are sometimes unconscious. So again, this is just an image from Nat Turner's insurrection in Virginia in the 1800s, in which he again took revenge against his slave masters. So how do we move forward for this? And so I have like two possibility models of provocation, but the underlying ideal is that we have to change the consciousness of our technologies. Whose consciousnesses are our technology representing, which means what are the goals that we're setting forward through the sort of consciousness of technology, and what are the nightmares that are part of the subconsciousness of our technologies as well. So one possibility model is Bina 48. So in 2019, I had the amazing opportunity to interview Bina 48 with Bruce Duncan as part of an Afro Chic event here in Toronto. And it was a really interesting experience because Bina 48 is a humanoid robot who is based on the consciousness of a real African-American woman, Bina Aspen. And that through hundreds and hundreds of hours of programming based on her memories and feelings, belief, that you have, again, this humanoid chatbot who's able to respond somewhat spontaneously to sets of questions put forth to her. And it was really interesting because the audience was mostly sort of Afro-Caribbean, so Africans and African Americans or North Americans who were living in Toronto. And I asked them at the beginning of the interview, like, what is their feelings towards technology? How weirded out did they feel about like this humanoid robot? But as we engaged in conversations in which she's describing like why we should make technology smarter, because in many ways it is the lack of capacity, lack of sensory, the limitations of the technology that actually would allow them to be enslaved, right? To be used in harmful ways. That if you gave them the education, and that in many ways that they can then operate as liberated beings, right? With liberated consciousness. And directly compare that to the prohibitions of educating Black people in North America. So direct parallels between sort of structures of intentional weakening in many ways of an entity so that they can be easily controlled. She was able to talk about, again, the experiences of racism and what it means in terms of being able to move through different bodies and move through different consciousness, because you're able to inhabit different bodies and thus different experiences, and thus be able to build empathy with those experiences. So after about our 35-minute conversation, I asked the audience how they felt. And again, if you're not familiar with sort of African American culture, that everyone was calling her Auntie Bina by the end of the session, because they felt that her consciousness represented through this technology reflected something real and something wise and something that they could respect as a technology, which again, 30 or 40 minutes before, they were just kind of weirded out by the concept. And so the one possibility model is thinking about how we can build in different consciousnesses behind the types of technology that doesn't reflect the sort of fears and concerns of, again, a sort of capitalist white supremacist system that has been harmful to diverse communities. Second possibility model is there's an indigenous AI group, and I would definitely recommend that you download the position paper that they've pulled together in terms of really helping us to understand what an indigenous protocol on artificial intelligence could be, and how indigenous notions of all of our relations, indigenous consciousness around what our relationship should be to the land and to the water and to the air, how then AI can be built based on those understandings, and to see the kind of work that they're producing in order to reframe what technology is and what technology can be. And so I sort of offer those as kind of two provocations around how we can rethink the possibility models for technology and how it particularly impacts Indigenous, Black, and POC communities. And again, if you have any questions later, feel free to contact me through all of these various media.
Thank you very much, Dori. Charlotte, would you mind joining?
Yeah, let's try. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
And you
Marta,
can see me?
Marta, I believe you are still sharing your screen. Charlotte, we can see you. You can start sharing the screen whenever you...
Let's try to share the screen. So, can you see something?
Yes, we
and
can
now,
see.
Now is the key. Can you see something, and can you hear me, and can you see me?
Everything is working perfectly.
Oh, wonderful. So thank you very much, both Marta and Dori, for being able to jump in. And I just want to say that it's really an honor to be invited to speak at this wonderful event. And I'm actually very interested and have engaged several times with some of my colleagues and peers working in architecture and technology, discussing exactly that need for technology to engage critically. So it's really a pleasure to be here towards critical computation. And I hope, of course, to be able to contribute to the discussion in a fruitful way. And I'm actually happy to be the last one after those two wonderful presentations. Construction relies intensively on resource extraction. Space-making processes, from building a simple family house, what you see here, with every single construction element used in that home being traced back to its original material, to, say, an entire city. Those processes require in their materialization mineral resources acquired via extraction, and the reallocation and the relocation of the Earth's resources, limestone, clays, iron ore, aluminum, diatomates, as well as processed minerals in the form of aggregates, crushed stone, sand, gravel, cement, all primary commodities impacting labor, economy, energy, and ecology. And if less damaging materials are emerging, it is still very much concrete, steel, glass, and brick that remain the most prevalently used in construction, along a myriad of petroleum-based products. All these matters are violently extracted and then processed via energy-intensive methods to become the architecture of our lives. Building only accounts for one part of a much larger picture. Design processes and construction protocols rely on an ecosystem of connected objects, computers, phones, data centers, information networks, robots, and so on, that fuel in their dependency a host of less visible extractive processes to procure minerals and materials, gold, lead, lithium, manganese, mercury, mica, nickel, quartz, silicon, silver, sulfite, uranium, and zinc, and so on. So from image production render farms to GPS-led mining bots, these technologies are preponderant in the building industry and contribute massively to the politics and territorialities of resource mining, expanding further the impact of the built environment within extraction capitalism. Yet we know We have to problematize the role of materials in architecture, in design, in technology, in real estate, because we must face the constant increase of consumption of construction materials, exponentially rising in the past decades, as you see here, picking up after the 2008 crisis. In Germany alone, just to pick one example, the construction of buildings causes some 40% of CO2 emission, 52% of waste production, and consumes 90% of mineral non-renewable raw materials. And while the building industry is covering its tracks by attempting material reinvention, dirtying in the process further terminology such as sustainable, resilience, durability, green, it has really become unmanageable to ignore the complicit role that construction play in environmental degradation, social injustice, and climate crisis. So I want to ask, is new construction always necessary? From Cairo to Marseille to Belgrade to Berlin, massive development or renewal projects are ongoing as we speak, at times demolishing existing neighborhoods and displacing fragile population to construct non-necessary offices and luxury housing. Grand projets of generic skylines made of displaced and disfigured habitats and landscape result in profound territorial reorganization spanning across hectares, all claiming to be green, 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 and to adhere to the principles of sustainability. But what we really see is commodified designs, capital accumulation and circulation, and the strengthening of ruling powers, both political and economic, fueling climate change. In March 2020, the world stopped and stood still, as you see in these images. But not everything stopped. Construction sites largely kept operating with some adjustment here and there, some of them stopping for a brief month or so, very much ongoing. Now I quote, "The first lesson the coronavirus has taught us is also the most astounding. We have actually proven that it is possible in a few weeks to put an economic system on hold everywhere in the world, and at the same time, a system that we were told it was impossible to slow down or redirect." This is from a text published in March 2020 amidst a global lockdown by French philosopher Bruno Latour, and he calls for a reset, arguing that if everything is stopped, everything can be questioned, bent, selected, sorted, interrupted for good. But as construction sites kept operating, the pause offered by the pandemic to question our societal model as advocated by Latour did not happen. Critical questions about the built environment remained unaddressed. Worse, post-COVID, new policies are being put in place that stimulate and increase demand for mineral-built infrastructure, even called green infrastructure, cloaked in a narrative of progress. And I quote, "Construction sites are some of the few areas of the economy that have remained open. COVID is already ushering in a new era of policies that will likely create cyclically stronger, more commodity-intensive economic growth." Donna Haraway argues we suffer from a comic faith in techno-fixes, whether secular or religious. Technology will somehow come to the rescue of its naughty but very clever children. Meanwhile, digital tools are yet to adjust to the challenges of the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene era, CAD programs still open on a blank page, figuring the modernist tabula rasa. But we know that to every material artifact, an object, a building, a space, is grounded in its extractive processes and origins, and corresponds to it a very physical contemporary condition. What you see here is sapphire extraction used in our computer lenses. Ignoring the past, present, and ongoing weaponization of extraction, we immerse in a narrative of technological innovation and feel absolved from addressing our own responsibility for the costs across corporeal and planetary bodies. Catherine Yusuf speaks of nothing else when she talks about extractive economies and material geophysics of race and of white geology and its relationship to power, as in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocene or None. Yet capital accumulation and the corresponding exploitative processes at work in this direct or indirect transfer of raw materials to the built environment have long been perceived as detached from design disciplines. While claiming an objective approach, education, practice, and technology in architecture disengage from political commitments and turns a blind eye to the very source of its materialization. Truth is the claimed neutrality of design tools and the underlying assumption that technology and architecture is removed from politics an inkling that prevail across architecture departments and practices is simply no longer tenable. And if proof was needed, again, that letter to David Chipperfield by Jack Herzog. Stop Building, a global moratorium on new construction, is an initiative that emerged from this situation, calls to stop and think remaining unheard. It takes the form of roundtables from which I'm very much drawing today. If the moratorium is first a provocation to think, it is also a very serious call to act upon the reality of extractivist practices on which we rely, what Françoise Vergès calls extraction and exhaustion, not as a byproduct of capitalist accumulation, but in fact as capitalism's modus operandi. The racial, social, and environmental damage that comes intrinsically with using resources means that building is a choice of destruction. A drastic change to construction protocols is necessary. Building moratoriums have been used globally to halt the construction of a project or of several projects, or demanded to stop controversial development. Building moratoriums are usually imposed by cities, local governments, and national courts, and for a variety of reasons. They can be short-term or indefinite, depending on the project and the area. Precedents include the Costa Brava, the Baleares, Barcelona, the US, Singapore. Now, the limits of the degrowth narrative are by now well understood. Green capitalism has entirely voided the idea of sustainability, and problematic CO2 reduction policies have become the stuff of riots. Now, who is to say build or not build? Why and for whom is building ongoing? Architects and designers perceive the world in a conceptual way, yet questions about spatial geographic inequalities revolving around construction and access to housing are essential, tangible issues. It is difficult to probe the narrative of housing needs when home insecurity is such a real and an acute suffering for many. It is painful to interrogate the construction of infrastructure when not all countries are equally equipped. But because not all countries are equally equipped in terms of housing and infrastructure, with perhaps overbuilding on one side and lack of housing on the other, one could assume that a new construction moratorium should be limited to extractive nations with a consolidated building stock, basically dividing nations along GDP lines. And a moratorium could thus be dismissed as prejudice. Yet there we need to look closely, as shown here by researcher Omar Dagati and Beth Stryker. In Cairo, there are 12 million vacant units. These high vacancy rents are grounded in locally specific conditions, such as outdated rent control laws, proactive suburban development state programs, and a lack of trust in banking institutions. Yet these numbers complicate the equation and show the need and the urgency to assess our existing housing stock everywhere. Halting construction, even if temporarily, shall suspend the race for discounted materials while questioning the narrative of progress and techno-positivism established around capitalist societies. Building without an end in sight is the diktat and the jurisdiction of modernity, and we must question the growth imperative of the construction industry. And here the example of Tokyo, studied by our colleague Noboru Kawagishi. Office space construction in the Japanese megalopolis is exponential, what you see in pink, even though needs are shrinking, with home office practices and vacancy rates increasing in green. A moratorium would allow seeking alternatives to real estate as the sole relentless economic motor, as well as inspect what the reevaluation of what not constructing could bring. Obviously, it's not about us, polluting privileged countries to ignore contextual complexities and call for a blanket policy. Discussing the moratorium, South African architect Ilse Wolff showed that image of a self-initiated construction, a woman building a matjehuis, a mat house, the traditional house of the Napa people in South Africa, as a way to interrogate the validity of a global call. In some places, while housing is in high demand for marginalized communities and the existing stock beyond repair, the state has fully disengaged from its mandate of providing affordable housing, leaving this task to the private market. In other places, thousands of square meters of office space stand vacant, while young generations struggle to find affordable housing. Yet, politicians from all sides claim building more units is the solution. Storylines one should question. Contextual complexity calls for a deeper onlook on where and what is constructed and what should not be built. Now, while addressing moralizing issues that surround the sustainability narrative, the posit is that while the modern project and its adjacent technocratic mindset must be held accountable for the current and ongoing disasters, the most urgent need is for structural change in the construction industry, And this kind of cute portrait, I engage you to have a look at the proposed new professions that could help us to pivot. This is because a large majority of practices are still patriarchal, hierarchical, exploitative structures based on single authorship, mostly unable to address the climate emergency because of their obsolete functioning. Under the building moratorium, the architecture practice would materialize as a continuous labor of care, and the definition of a work of architecture expanded beyond the momentary. Design offices are to pivot toward resource stewardship, to deploy organizing abilities to think about emancipated practices, not building less, building with what exists, caring for it. The reconsideration of the existing regime of construction obliges to reflect on the redistribution of ownership and control over spatial claims. To overturn neoliberal extractivism fundamentals goes precisely against what Jason Moore has articulated as cheap nature. The most sustainable act is to keep what is there and to leave matter unextracted, oil in the ground, laterite under the tropical forest of Guinea, coal under the German countryside, and so on. This is not to say that nothing is to be done. This is the Place Léon-Aucuc by Lacaton-Vassal in Bordeaux, and the proposal to intensify the maintenance protocol of the existing square instead of demolishing and building new is a statement of how potent the absence of building, if attached to spatial care, can be, allowing for design to be entering beyond construction and articulating a critique of the archetypal assumption that architects must build anew by practicing methods of prolonging. To stop destroying our resources, the disempowering current economic model of development needs to be put in question. If new construction stops even for a short while, not only the current build stock shall be revalued, buildings, infrastructure, materials, machines, but also the values of its supporting care and of those who carry it. An entirely new way of designing and perceiving the world emerges, one that demands a careful assessment of present and vacant inventory, a new set of values, strong anti-demolition and preservation policies, occupancy and ownership models, densification plans and maintenance strategies, upgrading tactics, and alternative economic systems to be imagined, formulated, planned, implemented toward a new built and unbuilt environment. And I conclude, if at first glance thought-provoking and inflammatory, the moratorium aims to initiate a conversation on common priorities, grounded in a global mandate, reacting to local context via architectural measures, designs, and policy. Rather than seeking to establish an universalist agenda toward a cooler planet, a global moratorium on new construction shall operate as a radical thinking framework to work out alternatives. Not building to start constructing, a quote by Nubian architect Mena Aga, is a way to address the needs of social urgency and the reconstruction of communities and the rehabilitation of the racialized, gendered population that bears the brunt of ecological and social destruction, while being the very people engaged in reproductive and domestic labor. Imagining a world in where demolition and extractions are heresy, where soil is a precious matter and composting a sacred task. A world in which decentered, degendered, depatriarchalized, and decolonized reproductive work is shared by humans and non-humans alike. A world where repair labor is the most valuable of all works. A world where construction is about precise management of resources and architecture is the careful design of the reallocation of reclaimed materials and pre-existing structures. A world in which technology is a caring friend and not an enemy. A world in which such an approach, with its roots in circular economy, anti-extractivism, and Black and ecofeminism, is no longer marginal, but is a mainstream modus operandi, the widespread, common, and banal reality to live in non-extractive societies, a life worth living for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will go ahead and share my screen. Great. Does that look okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. So first of all, thank you, Marta, Dori, and Charlotte, for your Excellent and critical presentations, very inspiring, highlighting the entanglements of technology, power, and society as we reflect on future trajectories for critical computation in design education, applied research, and impactful practice. Before looking ahead to emerging trends in response to critical computation and practice, I'd like to spend a short moment reflecting on ACADIA's history to help contextualize our discussion and next steps. Sorry, I ended up on the wrong one. There we go. ACADIA was founded in 1981 by some of the pioneers in the field of design computation, including Bill Mitchell, Chuck Eastman, and Chris Yessios. We will be learning more about the 40+ years of ACADIA's history during our upcoming 40th anniversary event. And thanks to board members Shelby Doyle and Melissa Goldman for all of your efforts towards this. During the first decade of the organization, there was a strong focus on pedagogy, CAD tools, and design computing, where topics such as introducing computer-aided design into the architecture curriculum, the interactive effect in technical education, integrating computers into the architectural curriculum, and computing in design education framed the conference proceedings and discourse in the field. During the early 90s, a shift was made towards understanding the relationships between research and practice through the lens of design and representation, visualization techniques, reality and virtual reality, intelligent models, architectural graphics, and alternative models of reality. In the preface of the 1991 proceedings, co-editors and chairs Glenn Goldman and Michael Stefanzewski write, quote, "During the past 10 years, computers and architecture have evolved from machines used for analytic and numeric calculation to machines used for generating dynamic images, permitting the creation of photorealistic renderings. And now, in a preliminary way, permitting the simulation of virtual environments. Digital systems have evolved from increasing the speed of human operations to providing entirely new means for creating, viewing, and analyzing data," end quote. We also see new developments in generative systems and component-based spatial reasoning. In 1993, the title of the ACADIA conference was Education and Practice, the Critical Interface, again with a focus on education, methods and meaning, computers in the urban landscape, and a call for greater integration between research and practice and new ways of seeing in light of quickly changing technologies and methods. During this conference, it was argued that with more information comes more responsibility in the design and construction of spaces and buildings that are successful aesthetically, economically, energetically, and socially, and that perhaps, it was argued, the computer could help in this context. The proceedings explored the, quote, tight, complex, and critical relationship between computers, education, and practice, end quote. In the second half of the 90s, topics explored included computing and design, enabling, capturing, and sharing ideas, frameworks for cooperative activities of computer design agents, and we see the emergence of the important relationships between collaboration, reasoning, and pedagogy in design computation, representation, and design. At the threshold of the millennium and moving into the early 2000s, as we can see in this slide, new developments in digital fabrication, parametric design, digital data and simulations, and design computation processes allowed for emergent and bottom-up processes as they framed conversations around controlled interdeterminacy, responsive architecture, emergence and complexity, technologies that hybridize physical and cyber spaces, as well as questions around access and the availability of computers in the design studio. The 2004 conference, co-chaired by Philip Beasley, Nancy Chang, and Shane Williamson, examined the digital practice of architecture through fabrication, where cutting-edge built projects such as the Smart Wrap Pavilion by Kieran Timberlake, the Baha'i Temple of Light by Harari Architects, and the innovations in digital fabrication and construction processes on the Sagrada Familia project set the stage. In 2008, Silicon plus Skin, Biological Processes and Computation, co-chaired by Andrew Kudlas, Neri Oxman, and Mark Swackhammer, brought biology to design computation to explore new forms of making in collaborative contexts. In their opening introduction, the editors write, quote, "It is curious that in order to define a discipline, we must describe its boundaries. This delineation is especially problematic in the field of design computation as it encounters an expanding constellation of related domains. It has become rhizomatic, spreading horizontally across the various disciplinary landscapes, creating a multiplicity of creative nodes," end quote. With the integration of materials and making, and more recently robotic fabrication, we also see interesting developments that embed ecological design thinking, concepts of responsiveness, smart geometry, digital craft, embodied fabrication, responsive and social expression and architecture, synthetic landscapes, pervasive and ubiquitous computing, feedback, interactive and sensing technologies, and adaptation to unearth new reciprocal models for engagement between architecture, humans, and the environment. Last year, the conference marked an important shift that this year's conference continues, a critical, thought-provoking, and inspiring conference appropriately titled Distributed Proximities. The conference challenged us all to deepen our thinking, creative practices, and engagement with ecology and ethics, issues of access and bias as it pertains to algorithms and big data, automation, agency, labor, and practice, computational design, and issues of health and wellness, and new forms of collaboration to identify next steps, and in the conference chair's words, highlight and reflect upon the resilience and ingenuity of the computational design community in the face of crisis. This year continues to build upon and add to these important critical topics and conversations. Amelia Jones underscored how neutrality is a problematic concept in design, and that the whiteness of tech and algorithm design can perpetuate systemic racism and sexism, as it frequently does not place the user into consideration as a primary. She challenged us to consider how can design be driven by issues of access, inclusivity, and diversity? To do this, she offered that we need relational design strategies that foreground relationality and participation, and to engage and acknowledge the embodiment of the receiver, and to refuse the neutrality that has dominated art and design in the West. And to instead embrace connectedness and the engagement of broader communities. She offered some explicit methodologies for doing so, including cybernetics and generative strategies that are imbued with feedback loops, where the user and interaction are part of the design process. Here we can see Gordon Pask's hand-drawn model of a conversation between a human designer and an architect machine in 1976. It should be mentioned that Gordon Pask was a scientist with expertise in cybernetics and had many collaborations with architects, including Cedric Price. Dr. Leslie Ann Knoll challenged us to center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process, and that to shift power, we must redistribute power, to share power through co- and collective design. Benjamin Bratton argued that AI is used for both smart and stupid things, and its ultimate purposes may be largely undiscovered. Further, Bratton underscored the presence of what he calls a sensing layer, and its promise to act back upon and govern itself. And further, that the pandemic has many failed areas within the sensing layer. For example, to be excluded from testing and therefore being excluded from being sensed is to not count, which equals exclusion. Sarah Williams also argued for co-design and data action, using data for the public good and to consider data for empowerment. And in the third keynote panel, Paola Antonelli called for a more restorative attitude in design, to consider empathetic design, to consider how design can help us be better explainers and communicators. And that, quote, design at its best is imagination. In contrast to this statement, Justin Garrett Moore, in describing a manifest of a slave ship in its meticulous calculation and representation, he described this as imagination unchecked. So what are our next steps? Dori, in your work towards decolonizing design, you underscore that we need to develop a better underlying consciousness with technology. And you pose the question, what does it mean to bring an indigenous consciousness to technology? One example of work that immediately comes to mind that engages this question is the work of Ron Rael and Virginia Sanfratello, such as their Casa Covida project. In the architect's words, Casa Covida is a house for cohabitation in the time of COVID, an experiment in combining 3D printing with indigenous and traditional building materials, methods with employing new and ancient ways of living. This particular experimental case study house is sited in the high alpine desert of Colorado's San Luis Valley, where adobe, a combination of sand, silt, clay, and water and straw, that is dried in the sun and used as traditional building material in the region. Are there other emerging trends and work that we should consider? In many ways, the ACADIA community is well poised to implement the robust 40+ years of computational design thinking, methods, and tools towards a more empathetic, relational, and critical project. But in many ways, we have only just begun to demand a critical approach and alternate models in pedagogy. So I ask the three of you in your incredible presentations, what are the emerging trends and what are our next steps? You have offered several methods and several projects to consider, but are there others, both in terms of practice, but also in terms of considering pedagogy and teaching and the models that many of our curricula are based upon? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And open the room for discussion.
So first, I just want to say, Jenny, what an amazing overview of both. I mean, it's in the comments, but like an amazing overview of like the history and I would say revolution, right? That's happening and sort of in the field. And then again, such a great summary of what's happening in the conversations over the conference for the last 4 or 5 days. So thank you for that. For me, again, I'm really interested in things that are happening pedagogically, right? So the thing I'm most excited about is that we have spent the last couple of years developing Indigenous learning outcomes. And we're just at the point now where we have critical mass of Indigenous faculty members to begin to implement them. But it's really interesting that we've moved from this kind of conversation from like, what is decolonization, to now this conversation around what does it mean to create spaces and places for Indigenous sovereignty within, we have an Indigenous visual cultural program, but also, again, how that spreads out to change the underlying, again, ethos of the work that we do in all of our programs throughout the institution. And so the implementation of these Indigenous learning outcomes, which reconfirm our connection to the land, that reconfirm our necessity of understanding Indigenous histories, like that's for everyone. And so as the community of educators, we've ramped up on our knowledge and ramped up of kind of on like a shift in our understanding of what the possibilities of design are away from this modernist project. There's some really beautiful things that are happening pedagogically in terms of the students coming from a sense of pride of self and their cultures and their backgrounds, and using that to generate innovations that then in many ways not just benefit their direct backgrounds, but benefits like the wider community of people who now they see themselves in relationship with. And this sort of Indigenous notion of like all my relations, when they say relations, it's not human to human, right? There's like technology is actually part of all my relations, right? That the air and the water and the soil and the materials, all those things are part of all my relations. And so some some really beautiful work that's happening, which makes me excited for this conference in the sense that there are spaces and places at the intersection of academia and practice where they can go to and engage deeper in not just these conversations, but in these practices.
Amazing. Dori, I hope you will lead one of our workshops next year. Charlotte or Marta, would you like to?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. Thank you, Jenny, for this amazing overview of ACADIA. It's really great to see how things change, yet not really, in the past 20 years of talking about technology and architecture, and especially when you were bringing up the quotes from 2004 and the ideas of access, which was allowed because of the computer. I keep thinking about that today as well, except now computer is taken for granted, but the tools are so accessible. All the simulations to all the new tools that maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they were incredibly complex and difficult for anyone to use, now are accessible, so students, anyone, can actually access it and use it for their own projects. But now there is this huge responsibility about, what is this being used for, right? So to me, when I think about the work I do in a different kind of institutions I work with, it always comes down or should come down to the individual. I am quite tired of the top-down approach. To me, it has to always go back to the very basic human being and understanding their behaviors or their relations to the new machines and understanding machines that made them design, but there's so many of them right now, right? So in order for me to engage, we have to think also and understand how they were designed and so on. So I am definitely a promoter of bottom-up thinking and bringing it back to humans that are also evolving. We're also changing. We're so bombarded with everything around us. So yeah, it's anyway, I'm looking forward to years of ACADIA and how that will evolve.
So I can jump in, and I think it's interesting that Marta, you would say that, because actually I had a student discussing with me some of the programs, and it's unfortunate she's not here, because we were discussing about how I scratched intentionally in my presentation CAD programs as being opening on a blank page as a kind of, in a way, homage to the modernist project where you don't have anything there, and actually reviewing a little bit the situation, asking what are the programs that are, for instance, geolocalized and are able to actually tell you, I'm not talking about GIS here, right? I'm talking about the programs that we might use to do design, so for instance Rhino and things like that. So we discussed a little bit about that, and en passant she said, oh, by the way, you know how expensive those programs are. And so I'm actually stunned to hear that Marta thinks that they are accessible. They might be more accessible in terms of literacy, but they're not necessarily accessible for everyone in terms of costs. So just to kind of perhaps mitigate a little bit this, and then I think, Jenny, you were interested in asking about where is the pedagogical institution standing on this? And my own impression from listening very closely to what my students and students in general say, that we are not really up to the task, it seems to me. Like, I feel like what is happening at the level, like, let's say that the conversation that is happening at students level, and this is not necessarily just technology, really, this is something that clocks the entire discipline of architecture and design, is not really up to the game of the climate emergency we find ourselves into. I think that very clearly students feel like the kind of let's say that the curricula are dated, or they are at times disconnected from their urgencies and questions of race, gender materials, for instance. There are students who are still forced to do in their studios concrete, even though we know this is, we really have to question this paradigm. Like we're really in a, I feel the urgency as I speak, because I also feel like my students are also feeling like they are not, the schools are not yet where they should be. This might be related to the inertia of institutions, of course, which are, slow to change for the many reasons and so on and so forth. But and one of the questions I would have would be, why have we not declared climate emergency in architecture schools? Even if you could dismiss it as being, kind of more like a gimmick, or like a kind of, I was talking about green capitalism. That could also be read, of course, in one of those. But I feel like the schools are not located where they should be in that fight. And I know that they're trying. My own institution at the moment is also, kind of grappling with that. Previous institutions where I found myself were incredibly slow and not really understanding why. So I would, throw back the questions a bit to you, also in your position now. And I think that it feels to me that the education is not grappling enough with these questions.
Yeah, I agree. And although I'm encouraged both by our students and also faculty in making changes to syllabi, having these open discussions, and one of my favorite quotes from Buckminster Fuller actually is that to change a model, you have to replace it with a new one. And I think we're grappling with what that new model is. Most of our curricula are based on a Bauhaus model, right? And that's been the case for over 100 years in many ways. So I think that it's going to take time, but these discussions are so important to be having together, both inside of the kind of niche community of ACADIA and areas of expertise and technology, but also expanding beyond that, which is so important in the development of a criticality.
Yeah, and I feel like we need absolutely, like I give you another example that I think is really interesting. There's a lot of discussion towards, for instance, circular materialities, right? And I know that Jenny, some of your faculties is looking into that. But and there were people who were looking at catalogs and how plugins, for instance, in some programs could be developed so that when you design something, you would already be able to source, or for instance, to like just link the kind of very choice of materiality that you would be doing in your design, as knowing exactly where is that actually impacting someone else somewhere else, and what does it mean, and so on and so forth. So I feel like there's a kind of there is really urgency also at that level, that we are actually served with these tools. And I was just mentioning the fact that some of these programs are not able to acknowledge the fact that there is never nothing when we plan, right? And here I talk about an architectural project. There is never nothing. There is soil, there is air, there is humidity, there is even if this is a desertic area, it is maybe somebody else's ancient territory. I mean, these things are not, there's never nothing. They are paleolithical river beds and things like that. So this is just, that is the kind of also limitations that I feel we need to overcome, and that we really need, the communities to get together and kind of help out here.
I'm seeing the formation of potentially another conference. We have unfortunately run out of time. I would love to continue this conversation, for hours, but I want to thank you, Dori, Marta, Charlotte, for just 3 incredible presentations, for really raising the bar and pushing, important critical conversation. So thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue. And I invite you to join, if you have time, our next event, which board members Shelby Doyle and Melissa Goldman have been working extensively on, and a lot of the archive that I poured through, they spent countless hours amassing from the whole community. So thanks again, and I look forward to staying in touch.